He was the most photographed face on the planet. Every move he made, every song he released, every step he took on stage was watched by millions. But somewhere in a quiet federal building far from the cameras, a very different kind of watching was happening. Agents, case numbers, sealed folders. For nearly a decade, the United States government kept a running file on Michael Jackson, and almost nobody outside a small circle knew it existed. Before we get into what was actually written in those pages, and the moment that turns this entire story on its head, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button. This channel exists to dig up the parts of these stories the headlines never had time for, and your subscription is what keeps this series alive. Okay, let's get into it. Every investigation has a starting point, and this one didn't begin with a raid or a headline. It began quietly, the way most paper trails do, long before anyone outside a records office ever knew to ask about it. It began with a piece of paper. After Jackson passed away, people close to his estate wanted answers to a question that had been whispered about for years. Was there really a federal file on him? And if so, what was in it? So a formal records request went in, the kind anyone in America is legally allowed to file. And weeks later, an answer came back that even the people closest to Jackson weren't fully prepared for. There was a file, a big one, hundreds of pages of internal memos, interview notes, forensic reports, and correspondence between field offices spread across different states and different countries. Here's the part that raises eyebrows. Only a portion of that file was ever handed over. A large chunk of it remains locked away, stamped as confidential, off limits even now. Which leaves the obvious question hanging in the air. What exactly is still being protected, and from who? Now, before anyone assumes this makes Jackson some kind of unique target, it's worth zooming out. A file like this isn't as rare as people think. Presidents have files, civil rights leaders have files, Hollywood legends have files, athletes, musicians, even judges have had their names appear in federal records at some point in their lives. Fame, money, and public attention tend to draw the eye of federal agencies, whether the person is a victim of threats or the subject of an allegation. And in Jackson's case, oddly enough, the paperwork shows him living as both at the exact same time. So why would a national agency get involved in something that, on paper, sounds like a local matter? According to people who've worked cases like this from the inside, it rarely starts with the agency taking over. It starts because a local department runs into a wall. They don't have the lab equipment. They don't have agents trained in digital forensics. They don't have a behavioral unit that can walk into a room and read a situation before a single accusation is confirmed or denied. So they make a call, and suddenly a case that started in a local precinct is being handled with tools built for national security work. That is essentially the role this agency played throughout Jackson's file. Not the department leading the charge from day one, but the specialist brought in when the situation demanded a level of expertise no local office could offer. It's a pattern that shows up again and again in high-profile cases. A small-town police department simply isn't built to analyze a damaged hard drive, trace an anonymous letter back to its origin, or fly a behavioral specialist across the country on short notice. So the file doesn't read like the story of one agency chasing a celebrity. It reads like a string of local requests, each one asking for a specific tool the bigger agency happened to have sitting in its toolbox. The earliest documented involvement stretches back to the early 1990s. According to the records, investigators were looking into claims tied to communication between Jackson and a minor overseas. Agents reportedly helped structure how a young witness should be interviewed, a process that requires enormous care to avoid contaminating testimony. Meanwhile, forensic teams were combing through hard drives and storage devices, searching line by line for anything that could constitute illegal material. This was the file's heaviest chapter, the one that framed Jackson as a possible suspect. It wasn't a quick look and a shrug, it was methodical. It crossed state lines, it reportedly crossed oceans. Hold that thought, because where all of this eventually lands is the entire reason this story is worth telling. But here's what almost nobody talks about. The same file that treated Jackson as a person of interest also treated him as a man living under constant threat. Buried in those pages is the story of an individual who became dangerously fixated, not even on Jackson directly at first, but on a member of his own family. Letters started arriving, rambling, unstable, increasingly violent in tone. At one point, the writer allegedly claimed he was prepared to open fire at one of Jackson's own concerts if that's what it took to get close enough to hurt him. It didn't stop there. The same person is said to have made threatening references toward a sitting head of state, language serious enough that it pulled in an entirely different level of federal attention. Eventually, according to the documents, that individual was located and taken into custody standing right outside property belonging to Jackson's own parents. Sit with that for a second. While the public saw an untouchable global superstar, the paperwork tells a story of a man whose own family's front yard had become a site of genuine danger. Being the most famous person alive apparently came with a shadow nobody in the audience ever saw. It's worth pointing out how rarely a single file contains both sides of a story like this. Most federal files fall neatly into one lane. Either someone is being investigated or someone is being protected. Jackson's file did both at once, sometimes within the same month, sometimes even referencing the exact same set of agents working two completely different assignments tied to the same man. That overlap alone says something about just how strange and how uniquely public his entire existence had become. And this wasn't an isolated incident buried quietly in a single folder. Across the years, the file reportedly documents multiple threat cases tied to Jackson and people around him, ranging from unsettling fan mail to more organized, more calculated warnings that required an actual protective response rather than a polite dismissal. Security details had to be briefed, concerts had to be reassessed, travel routes were reportedly altered. None of that ever made the tabloid covers, because none of it fit the narrative the public was used to consuming. A story about a stalker being taken into custody doesn't sell magazines the way a courtroom scandal does, so it simply never got the airtime it probably deserved. Then came the trial, the one that turned into a worldwide media event, cameras stacked outside a courthouse for weeks, reporters camping out overnight for a seat inside. And this is where the file takes its strangest turn yet. The sheer size of the crowd outside that courthouse became a concern of its own. Local law enforcement grew worried about something most people watching at home never considered. Not guilt or innocence, but physical security. With that many people packed into one location day after day, the situation stopped being just a legal matter and started looking like a potential target. So a request went out asking federal analysts to evaluate whether the courthouse itself, simply because of the crowds it generated, had become vulnerable to an attack. Think about that framing for a moment. A celebrity trial had escalated to the point where it needed a threat assessment normally reserved for events of national significance. That alone tells you how far this story had traveled from a simple courtroom proceeding. What started as a legal case about one man's guilt or innocence had, almost accidentally, turned into a logistical and security puzzle involving helicopters circling overhead, satellite trucks lining the streets for blocks, and a daily crowd large enough that emergency planners had to treat the courthouse the way they would treat a stadium hosting a championship game. Nobody sitting in that crowd thought of themselves as part of a security risk assessment. They just wanted to see history unfold in front of them. But on paper, to the people responsible for public safety, they were a variable that had to be measured and managed like any other. So if a file this extensive existed for years, why not release the whole thing? Why hold back so much of it? The reasoning tends to be fairly practical. Anything still tied to an open matter, anything that could theoretically resurface in a legal proceeding, typically stays sealed. There's also the matter of protecting sources. People who provide information to investigators are frequently promised confidentiality, regardless of whether what they said turned out to be accurate. That's usually the explanation behind the heavy black redaction bars covering entire paragraphs. It isn't automatically evidence of a cover-up. Sometimes it's simply the system doing what it's designed to do, protect identities first and worry about public curiosity second. Which brings us to the one question that actually matters after all of this. After years of forensic work, cross-country coordination, and international cooperation, what did investigators ultimately conclude? According to people who reviewed the released material closely, there is no documented evidence within those pages showing that Jackson ever committed an act of abuse against a child. Not a single confirmed finding. After everything, computer forensics, interviews, years of case files moving between continents, the paper trail simply does not contain proof of wrongdoing. Read that again slowly. An investigation with this much manpower, this much technology, and this much time behind it, the conclusion sitting at the bottom of the file is an absence, not a confirmation. An absence. It raises a strange, almost uncomfortable thought. For years, one of the most resourced investigative bodies in the world kept a quiet, ongoing watch on one of the most recognizable men in the world. Think about the resources that phrase actually represents. Flights booked on short notice, forensic labs running analysis for weeks at a time, agents pulled from unrelated cases to sit in on sensitive interviews. This wasn't a file that got opened once and forgotten in a drawer. It was actively worked, reopened, and revisited across more than one decade, which tells you the government itself never treated the question as closed, even when the public had already made up its mind one way or the other. They approached him as a potential threat and treated him as a person worth protecting, sometimes in the very same year. They spent real money, real hours, and real expertise chasing down the truth wherever it led. And when all of it was finally laid out on the table, what they found matched the version of events his most devoted fans had believed the entire time. The full picture may never be completely public. Remember, a large portion of that file is still sitting behind closed doors, unreleased and unexplained. But out of everything that has come to light so far, the most striking part of this story isn't what investigators managed to dig up. It's what, after 10 years of looking, they never found at all. If this pulled you in the way it pulled me in, subscribe for more stories, the headlines left out, and let me know in the comments. Does this change the way you think about everything that happened back then? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.